Hey everyone and hello, Emily. Tonight, we dive into the world of men clad head to toe in steel, whose solution to most problems involved swinging hunks of sharpened metal with grim determination. Yes, we're talking about medieval knights. Before you settle in, if you genuinely love what we do here, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if it feels right. And drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. It's thrilling to know who's joining our little corner of history tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background. Let's slip into this journey together. If medieval swords worked the way movies claim, every knight would have strolled onto the battlefield whistling a heroic tune, brimming with confidence. In reality, most were thinking, if this sword is all that stands between me and a gruesome end, I deeply regret every life choice that led me here. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The sword wasn't the star. It wasn't even the supporting actor. Knights hated using their swords. Pulling it meant everything else had already gone horribly wrong. Lance shattered, spear broken, shield lost in the chaos behind them. Now they're ankle-deep in mud, clutching 3 pounds of steel like it's a last-ditch prayer. Hollywood swordplay looks like a choreographed ballet graceful, sweeping, poetic. Real combat, more like 2 exhausted laborers swinging crowbars in a ditch. Armor didn't crack open on impact. It just laughed in your face, reminding you how fragile your dreams really were. Swinging a sword at plate, armor was like knocking politely on a vault door that would never budge. Knights knew this. So instead of trying to slice through steel, they hunted the weak spots: armpits, elbow creases, throat slits, and that awkward groin flap nobody wants to name. Medieval fight manuals read like grim field guides. Here's exactly where to stab a man to ruin his entire existence. Enter one of the most brutally, practically, and utterly unsung techniques: half sword. Yes, the knight grabs his own blade with a gloved hand and turns it into a short spear. Sounds insane. It worked. Contrary to fantasy novels, medieval swords weren't laser-sharp death rays. They were sharp enough to wound, but not so sharp that touching the edge would sever your fingers. They were tools, not enchanted relics. And with thick leather or steel gauntlets, knights could safely grip the blade without turning their hand into mincemeat. Why half-sword? Precision, desperation. When swinging wildly won't cut it, literally. You need surgeon-like control, except you're inside a metal sauna, covered in sweat and blood, while someone's trying to end you. Medieval combat was operation, but with broken bones and permanent consequences. Fight manuals from the 1400s are filled with illustrations of knights jamming blades into armpits, prying open helmets, or smashing pummels into faces like impatient office workers, fixing a jammed printer with extreme prejudice. And let's not forget, full-swing sword fighting was exhausting. After minutes of clanging steel, your arms turned to jelly. Half-swording conserved energy while keeping you lethally efficient, but you'll never see it in movies. Why? Because an actor grabbing the blade breaks the magic. Some viewer would scream, he'd lose his hand, while clutching their soda like a battlefield medic. Yet real knights did it constantly because looking cool mattered less than staying alive. If swords were the polite handshake of medieval warfare, then maces were the brutal, bone-shattering shove that said, "I'd like you to stop breathing now." Knights didn't carry maces for fashion. They carried them because plate armor had made swords nearly obsolete. Once steel encased a man like a walking tank. Swords whimpered in protest. They were great against cloth and flesh, but useless against forged steel. Enter the mace. No blades, no edges, just pure, unapologetic impact. A solid hit didn't just bruise. It sent shockwaves through the body, rattling organs and warping armor so badly the victim had to be pried out like a crumpled soda can. Chroniclers called these wounds significant historian, code for his skeleton folded like laundry. Maces were beautifully simple, a handle, a heavy head, maybe some spikes if the smith was feeling spicy. No fancy metallurgy, just physics, applied with violent enthusiasm. And they didn't care who you were, king, peasant, or accountant. Or skull was equally fragile to a well-swung mace. Training. Swordsmanship took years. Mace mastery. 30 seconds. Lift, swing, repeat until they stop moving. It was the medieval equivalent of smashing that but inefficient, satisfying, and brutally final. Psychologically, a sword suggested a duel. A mace screamed, "I've abandoned all pretense of elegance." Hollywood avoids them, they're not glamorous. But knights loved them because they worked. And if the mace was hitting someone with a brick, the warhammer was what happened when a blacksmith asked, "What if we made the brick smarter?" Forget video game versions, giant, gleaming, wielded by shirtless berserkers. Real warhammers were compact, practical, and engineered for one job, making armored men regret wearing metal. One end, a hammer face that delivered universe reconsidering impacts. The other, a narrow spike designed to punch through joints like a can opener through soup. This wasn't about flair. It was about forcing a spike through a visor slit with one sharp thrust and ending the fight forever. Unlike axes, warhammers didn't get stuck. The spike slid in and out. Ready for the next target. Hollywood ignores them because there's nothing cinematic about calmly puncturing a helmet like you're testing a melon for ripeness. But historically, warhammers were the ultimate equalizers, small, unassuming, and devastating. If swords were for ceremonies and maces for stress relief, warhammers were for when a knight whispered, "This person needs to disappear now." Axes, the known nonsense brawlers of the battlefield. Forget lumberjack fantasies. Combat axes were sleek, fast, and built by people who clearly had trust issues. They excelled at chopping through shields, splitting helmets, and hacking whatever the enemy left exposed. But they weren't just blades, they were multi-tools of mayhem. Many had a hook on the back to yank shields aside, drag knights off horses, or pull foes into range for a finishing blow. Imagine mid-charge, feeling a hook latch onto your shield like a medieval tow truck, tunned suddenly, your dignity's on the ground. Axes also ruled at destroying wood, shields, spear shafts, barricades. If it was made of timber, an axe turned it to kindling, and they were cheap peasants, could afford them. Much to the dismay of historians trying to keep class lines neat, Hollywood avoids axes because they lack grace. But real knights embraced them because elegance doesn't stop. Spear in a muddy field full of screaming men. And then there's the true hero of medieval warfare, the unsung champion that won more battles than every sword combined. The spear. No songs, no ceremonies, no knight ever rode into a hall holding a spear aloft like a trophy. And yet, spears ruled the battlefield. Why? Reach. In a sword fight, your enemy's close enough to smell your fear. With a spear, you're stabbing from 2 meters away, plenty of time to wonder if he flosses. A thrust kept danger at bay. A cavalry charge with a lance. That wasn't a duel, it was a medieval missile strike. The kinetic energy could shatter ribs, unseat riders, or send a man flying so hard his descendants felt it. Even untrained soldiers could use a spear, pointy end toward enemy. That was the lesson. Generals adored them, no years of training required. Just ranks of men holding long sticks, turning the battlefield into a forest of death. Formations like shield walls and pike squares turned infantry into human porcupines, daring cavalry to charge into a wall of steel. Maintenance. Swords needed constant care. Spears replaced the stick, maybe the tip. They were the IKEA furniture of war, cheap, functional, and surprisingly deadly. Hollywood avoids spears because fights end too fast. They're efficient, terrifying, and lack the twirling drama directors crave. But knights knew the truth. Pray your sword stays sheathed. Keep your spear in hand. And what about the lance charge? Movies paint it as majestic, 2 nobles galloping in slow motion, lances gleaming, violins soaring. Reality, more like an unlicensed demolition derby inside a metal oven. It was a controlled collision at full gallop, less noble duel, more high-speed train wreck. Lances shattered on impact by design. An unbreakable lance would have turned jousts into decapitation contests, and medieval crowds might have loved that too much. On real battlefields in even ground, dust clouds, enemies actively trying to kill you, it was chaos. Miss your strike, you might tumble off your horse like a dropped sack of grain. Knights often ended up on their backs, flailing like armored turtles, praying no one noticed before it was too late. Once the lance broke in, it always did, they dropped it and switched to maces, axes, or daggers. Lances were single-use shock weapons, high risk, high reward, and brutally effective at shattering enemy lines. If swords were dueling tools and axes emergency options, lances were the battlefield equivalent of shouting, "I'm here and I mean business." Then came the poleaxe, unhinged multi-tool your medieval uncle kept in his armory, the one with too many functions and zero mercy. This wasn't just an axe on a stick. It was a triple threat, axe blade on one side, hammer on the other, and a long spike on top, like it had a personal vendetta. Reinforced with metal strips, it could chop, smash, stab, hook, pry, and probably open wine bottles if it felt like it. In tournaments, knights dueled with poleaxes in full armorless fencing, more physics-based skull testing. Manuals offered blunt advice: strike the head, strike the body, strike whatever's in front of you. Not exactly poetic. On the battlefield, it didn't care what armor you wore, mail, plate, or none at all. The hammer dented steel like foil. The axe cleaved shields and bone. The spike hunted gaps with terrifying patience. It was also a grappling weapon. Hooks yanked enemies off balance, dragged shields away, or pulled foes into stabbing range. Get caught. Congrats, you're now in a wrestling match where your opponent has a murder stick. For all its brutality, the poleaxe was elegant in design. Every part had a purpose. No wasted motion, just pure, efficient problem solving. If swords were art, poleaxes were engineering. And in a world of mud, blood, and desperation, engineering won. Finally, the dagger, small, unassuming, and brutally honest. No glittering names like Heartseeker, just cold, hard utility. Knights carried daggers because every battle, no matter how grand, eventually devolved into two armored men rolling in the mud like furious turtles. And when you're tangled in 60 pounds of steel, you don't swing a sword, you pull out something stabby. Target the gaps, neck, armpits, eye slits, groin. Armor had to leave openings or knights would have died of heatstroke before the first arrow flew. Real daggers weren't flashy. They were short, stiff, and built for one job, thrusting into places that ended lives. The rondel dagger, with its thick, triangular blade, was basically a precision tool for puncturing stubborn armor-on souls. Fight manuals show knights pinning foes and driving daggers into visors like they're prying open a jar that's been sealed by the gods. No grace, no drama, just raw, desperate intent. But daggers weren't just for killing. They cut ropes, prepared meals, adjusted armor, carved wood, and, yes, even performed battlefield surgery. Same blade that ended a duel could slice an apple or remove an arrow. Hollywood ignores them. They're not flashy. But ask any knight. The dagger often delivered the final signature on a contract, written in blood. So yes, swords are iconic. But remember, if a knight was using his sword, the day had already gone catastrophically wrong, because, in the real Middle Ages, survival wasn't about looking heroic, it was about staying alive long enough to complain about it later. Heroes, not the gleaming statues on horseback. The real heroes of the battlefield were the shields exhausted, overworked, chronically underestimated, and utterly indispensable. They were the silent guardians who held chaos at bay while everyone else took the spotlight. Knights didn't carry shields because they looked noble. They carried them because not dying is astonishingly difficult when every person around you is actively trying to end your life. A shield wasn't just wood slapped together. It was layered engineering, planks of seasoned timber, rawhide laced tight, hide glue binding it all, edged in reinforced metal, sometimes painted with symbols that took longer to dry than the knight expected to survive. Forget decoration. A shield was a portable fortress strapped to your arm. Hollywood treats it like a polite prop, lifted gently to deflect a courteous sword swing from a villain who apparently RSVP'd to the duel. Reality. Shields were weapons in their own right. Knights punched with them, slammed with them, shoved, bashed, and dropped enemies like sacks of grain. Imagine a man in full armor charging at you, wielding what's essentially a wooden door fused to his forearm. That's shield combat. A solid bash could knock a foe off his feet, crack ribs, shatter teeth, or end a fight. Don't underestimate that metal edge. Swing it sideways with enough medieval fury, and it could collapse a lung or snap bone like dry kindling. Shields came in shapes for every job. The kite, shield long, elegant, perfect for cavalry, and perfect for turning every gallop into an upper body workout. The heater, compact, light, less likely to dislocate your shoulder when struck. Round shields, ideal for cracking a Viking's skull if you ever found yourself lost in Scandinavia. But shields were more than defense. They were command centers. Knights emblazoned them with heraldry, not for vanity, but survival. On a battlefield teeming with identical steel shells, a yellow lion or crimson cross was the only way your allies knew not to stab you in the back. Of course, shields broke a phone. One solid axe blow could split it down the middle, leaving the knight clutching what now resembled an overpriced, splintered pizza slice. But that was the point. Better the shield shatter than your spine. In the grand theater of war, the shield was the quiet, reliable coworker who did all the heavy lifting while the sword pranced around, taking bows. And if you imagine medieval combat as a noble exchange of graceful swordplay between two honorable warriors, I'm sorry to say you've been watching too many fantasy films that look suspiciously like shampoo commercials. Real knightly combat often ended with two armored men writhing in the mud like furious armadillos locked in a death hug. Yes, knights wrestled constantly, far more than their gleaming reputations would suggest. Grappling wasn't a last resort, it was standard curriculum. Medieval fight manuals penned by scribes who clearly delighted in drawing men tumbling headfirst into disaster, filled with throws, joint locks, leg sweeps, and techniques for flinging your opponent into the dirt while simultaneously crushing his windpipe with the grace of a disgruntled god. There are even illustrations of knights flipping each other upside down like armored acrobats who'd made several catastrophic life choices. Why? Because once you're close enough to grab your enemy, swinging a sword is as useful as brandishing a baguette. So knights closed in, grabbing armor edges, twisting limbs, hooking legs, and slammed each other into the earth with enough force to make modern wrestlers wince. Thanks to armor absorbing most blows, they could go Ulan without instant death. The result? Wild, chaotic, and deeply undignified brawls. The goal was simple: get your opponent on the ground. Once he's down, gravity becomes your greatest ally. He won't rise quickly if at all, and once he's pinned, flailing like an overturned beetle, that's when you reach for the next chapter, the one your mother warned you never to read aloud. The victor draws a rondel dagger, stiff, triangular spike, built not for slashing, but for precision insertion, and begins the grim work of convincing armor to stop interfering with the business of killing. Grappling also let knights break grips, disarm foes, or simply exhaust them into submission. Sometimes they wrestled because weapons got stuck in plate, sometimes because visibility was zero, and sometimes just because they tripped. Yes, much of medieval combat began with someone slipping on mud, blood, or what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of banana peels. Hollywood omits this. Nothing shatters heroic fantasy faster than Sir Gallant of House Sparkle Fountain accidentally clotheslining his rival into a puddle. But real knights knew the truth. When finesse fails, grab, throw, and stomp like your life depends on it, because it did. If knights had one true advantage, it wasn't chivalry, honor, or even clean socks. It was armor. Armor was their walking fortress, their mobile insurance policy, their daily plea to the universe: please don't stab me today. Unlike Hollywood's clanking tin cans that make knights waddle like vending machines with existential crises, real medieval armor was shockingly mobile. Knights could run, leap, scale ladders, and even perform clumsy, sweat-drenched somersaults. Dancing, technically possible, advisable, Absolutely not. Armor evolved for one purpose: keep the knight alive long enough to complain about the battle over ale later. Mail stopped cuts. Plate deflected nearly everything except gravity, tax collectors, and sarcasm. A fully armored knight was essentially a medieval tank, slow to start, hard to kill, and built to absorb punishment. And contrary to myth, it wasn't crushingly heavy. A full suit weighed 40 to 60 pounds, the same load modern infantry carry, and the weight was distributed evenly across hips and shoulders, not dumped on the neck like a cursed backpack. Knights didn't waddle. They power waddled with grim determination. The real enemy wasn't weighted, was heat. Wearing a steel oven under a midday sun meant sweating out half your body weight per hour. Inside that helmet, a sauna with zero ventilation and a 100% chance of someone poking a hole in your face. Every night faced the same brutal choice: lift your visor for air and risk a spear through the eye, or keep it shut and pray your vision didn't blur from condensation. Because armor worked too well, fights lasted longer. Blows that would have turned an unarmored foe into paste just bonked off a knight with a hollow echo, annoying, survivable, and deeply unsatisfying for the attacker. That's why weapons evolved to be crueler: maces, warhammers, poleaxes, anything that could turn dents into internal trauma. But armor had gaps: armpits, elbows, throat, groin, places no one wants to think about during combat suddenly became prime real estate for daggers, spikes, and pointed insults. Knights knew their armor was their lifeline, but also that one misplaced thrust into the wrong crevice could ruin their entire month. So yes, armor was a marvel of engineering. It was also hot, exhausting, and occasionally humiliating, especially when you toppled into the mud and needed 2 squires to right you like a tipped-over wardrobe. If movies told the truth, medieval battles would be polite affairs. 2 knights step forward, exchange poetic vows, then duel with balletic precision while the world holds its breath. More like a metallic riot inside a barn that's actively reality. More like a metallic riot inside a barn that's actively collapsing. The idea of a clean one-on-one duel is charmingly naive. On a real battlefield, if you paused to deliver a dramatic challenge, 8 enemies would sprint over and stab you before you finished your second sentence. Medieval warfare wasn't fair. It wasn't cinematic. It was a muddy, deafening free-for-all where teamwork meant don't impale the guy wearing your colors. Visibility, terrible. Helmets had eye slits narrower than a miser's smile. Smoke, dust, and screams filled the air. Half the time, knights swung blindly, praying they hadn't just bludgeoned their cousin. Footwork was a nightmare. Mud, blood, broken weapons, and corpse piles turned the ground into a hazard course. Knights slipped constantly. Battlefields may have invented slapstick comedy. Falling in full armor wasn't graceful. It was like watching a refrigerator attempt yoga. And getting up, even worse. As a knight flailed like a stranded turtle, enemies often took the opportunity to introduce his helmet to a mace. Formations unraveled within minutes. Neat lines dissolved into tangled mosh pits. Cavalry charged through friend and foe alike. Archers fired blindly into the chaos, sometimes hitting allies. Commanders bellowed orders no one heard. It's a miracle anyone survived. Most didn't die in dramatic duels. They died from exhaustion, heat stroke, inside their own armor, or being trampled by a horse that was just as terrified and confused as they were. Hollywood hides this because it's messy. The real battlefield wasn't a stage, it was an overcrowded disaster zone where survival depended on awareness, endurance, and sheer spite. Knights didn't fight noble duels mid-battle. They survived the same way we survive Mondays, stumbling forward, dodging chaos, and hoping everyone else was having a worse day. Which explains why knights carried so many weapons. Because nothing worked on everyone. Choosing weapons wasn't about flair. It was like a medieval handyman opening a toolbox full of solutions for very specific, very violent problems. Hollywood pretends knights had one signature blade. Like fantasy RPG characters with personal branding. Real knights swapped weapons faster than we switch apps. Every tool had a job. The sword, great against peasants, useless against steel pumpkins. The mace, perfect for crushing armor, terrible beyond arm's reach. The spear, excellent for keeping danger at bay until someone stepped inside your guard and suddenly you're holding a very long, very awkward broomstick. The battlefield wasn't polite. It was chaotic, muddy, and aggressively unpredictable. One moment you're charging on horseback with a lance. The next, your horse decides it's done with your nonsense and dumps you into a ditch. Now you need a dagger. Therapy wasn't invented yet against plate. Bring a hammer. Against mail, an axe or thrusting blade, chasing a fleeing enemy, spear for reach, caught in close quarters, grapple and dagger, facing a better armored, better rested foe with superior morale. Run, historically accurate. Knights didn't collect weapons for style, they hedged their bets. Mace for crushing, sword for stabbing, dagger for finishing, spear for poking, warhammer for when someone got ideas. If flamethrowers existed, they'd have carried them. Weapons were even seasonal. Mud made long poles unwieldy. Forests choked spears. Tight ranks turned swords into liabilities. And horses. Horses didn't care about your honor or your shiny armor. They just wanted to live. In short, knights used whatever worked. Weapons weren't chosen for symbolism, they were selected for survival and maximum enemy discouragement. Movies give knights signature blades. History gave them a shopping list. That romantic image of the noble, shining, knight, graceful, heroic. Flawless is a beautiful fiction spun by poets and painters who never smelled a battlefield. The real knight was a tactical athlete, a walking sauna drenched in sweat, soreness, and regret. His life was 20% training, 10% fighting, and 70% complaining about both. Training meant sprinting in steel. Wrestling in 60 pounds of layered fabric and metal, riding uncooperative horses, and practicing gymnast-level maneuvers all while baking inside a human pressure cooker. He wasn't a bodybuilder. He was endurance strong, the kind of strength that lets you swing a warhammer for 30 minutes straight while avoiding heat stroke and corpses. On the battlefield, knights weren't calm or polished. They were tactical survivors. Every choice mattered. When to charge, retreat, feign, retreat, grapple, switch weapons, or scream for help because your foot was stuck in someone else's ribcage. They understood physics, leverage, angles, weight distribution. They knew which weapon pierced which armor And which moves got you killed by Tuesday? And the sweat, oh, the sweat. Nights sweated in winter, in shade during naps. Their Under Armour padding likely smelled like wet dog, old stew, and existential dread. Yet despite the grime, chaos, and constant discomfort, nights were professionals, trained, disciplined, and shockingly effective. They mastered an entire ecosystem of violence that Hollywood ignores because the truth is messier, louder, and far funnier than any staged duel. The real knight wasn't a statue come to life. He was a gritty problem solver in overheating steel, swinging whatever tool kept him breathing one more minute. And yes, he was always sweaty. Now, shift gears. Theodora's story didn't begin in gilded halls or perfumed chambers. It began in the roaring, stinking chaos of Constantinople's underbellious city, where fate wasn't decided by emperors, but by the thunder of hooves in the hippodrome. Born around the year 500, she was the middle daughter of Acacius, a bear trainer whose livelihood hung on the fickle whims of the racing factions. These weren't mere sports teams, they were street armies, political machines, and social tribes rolled into one. To be tied to them was to live on the razor's edge between glory and ruin. Theodora learned that lesson. Before she could walk, her father served the Greenza, powerful, volatile faction known for brawling mobs and shifting loyalties. His job, train the bears that performed between races, a dangerous gig that paid little but offered fragile stability. Young Theodora spent her days behind the hippodrome's stables, clutching her father's cloak, peering through splintered wood. Acacius died suddenly. Some said fever, others whispered of a bear's claw gone wrong. With him went the family's only lifeline. Poverty struck like a dagger. Left with 3 daughters and no protector, Theodora's mother faced a city with no mercy, with no trade, no money, and no faction backing. They were one step from starvation. In desperation, she led her girls into the hippodrome itself. They wore garlands, faces scrubbed, hair braided, a performance of innocence before thousands. She knelt before the blues, begging for sanctuary after the greens abandoned them. It was humiliating. It was theatrical. It was survival, and it worked. Moved by pity, politics, or spectacle, the blues took them in. For Theodora, standing in that roaring arena, she learned her first great truth. Birth doesn't grant power, performance does. That moment planted the seed of the woman she would become. Fierce, strategic, unbreakable. If her childhood taught her anything, it was that the world rewards those who command attention. And in Constantinople, no stage offered more power or more peril than the theater. By her teens, Theodora became an actress, a profession that, in Byzantium, came hand in hand with another identity, courtesan. It was a world of glittering highs and crushing lows, where applause could crown you queen and a single rumor could bury you. Theaters weren't temples of art, they were raucous dens of sailors, senators, drunks, and spies, all hungry for spectacle. Performers didn't just act, they provoked, seduced, mocked, and enchanted on demand. For Theodora, this wasn't degradation, it was training. It sharpened her wit, honed her instincts, and taught her to read a crowd like a general reads a battlefield. She stood out, her comic timing razor sharp, her agility breathtaking, her beauty undeniable. But it was her mind ironic, observant, impossible to ignore, that catapulted her beyond the chorus. She refused to be boxed in. One night, a comic servant flinging punchlines like daggers. The next, a tragic heroine whose voice could crack marble. Audiences loved her unpredictability, but fame cast a dark shadow. She caught the eye of Hesebolas, a provincial governor who saw her as a possession, not a partner. He took her to North Africa, expecting obedience. He got rebellion. Hesebolas was domineering, jealous, dismissive of her intelligence. When he abandoned her, bitter and humiliated Theodora was stranded in a foreign land, broke, alone, and furious. Yet that betrayal became her forge. She fought her way back, not with tears, but with cunning. She worked, saved, negotiated, and maneuvered across the Mediterranean, surviving by sheer will. The journey stripped her of illusion and gifted her strategy. She returned to Constantinople, not as the girl who danced for coins, but as a woman who understood one truth: applause is fleeting, power is permanent. And the city was ripe for change. Old alliances crumbled. New players rose. The palace hummed with tension. Theodora, now in her 20s, refused to return to the theater's backstage shadows, the world of exploitation disguised as entertainment instead. She disappeared into quiet respectability, taking up wool spinning, a humble trade that demanded patience and discipline. To observers, it looked like retreat. They were wrong. This was reinvention. She let gossip reshape her. The scandalous actress had become pious, modest, even virtuous, in a city where rumors could topple emperors. In desperation, she led her girls into the hippodrome itself. They wore garlands, faces scrubbed, hair braided, a performance of innocence before thousands. She knelt before the blues, begging for sanctuary after the greens abandoned them. It was humiliating. It was theatrical. It was survival. And it worked. Moved by pity, politics, or spectacle, the blues took them in. For Theodora, standing in that roaring arena, she learned her first great truth: birth doesn't grant power, performance does. That moment planted the seed of the woman she would become: fierce, strategic, unbreakable. If her childhood taught her anything, it was that the world rewards those who command attention. And in Constantinople, no stage offered more power or more peril than the theater by her teens. Theodora became an actress, a profession that, in Byzantium, came hand in hand with another identity: courtesan. It was a world of glittering highs and crushing lows, where applause could crown you queen and a single rumor could bury you. Theaters weren't temples of art, they were raucous dens of sailors, senators, drunks, and spies, all hungry for spectacle. Performers didn't just act, they provoked, seduced, mocked, and enchanted on demand. For Theodora, this wasn't degradation. It was training. It sharpened her wit, honed her instincts, and taught her to read a crowd like a general reads a battlefield. She stood out, her comic timing razor sharp, her agility breathtaking, her beauty undeniable. But it was her mind, ironic, observant, impossible to ignore, that catapulted her beyond the chorus. She refused to be boxed in. One night, a comic servant flinging punchlines like daggers. The next, a tragic heroine whose voice could crack marble. Audiences loved her unpredictability, but fame cast a dark shadow. She caught the eye of Hesebolas, a provincial governor who saw her as a possession, not a partner. He took her to North Africa, expecting obedience. He got rebellion. Hesebonus was domineering, jealous, dismissive of her intelligence. When he abandoned her bitter and humiliated Theodora was stranded in a foreign land, broke, alone, and furious. Yet that betrayal became her forge. She fought her way back not with tears, but with cunning. She worked, saved, negotiated, and maneuvered across the Mediterranean, surviving by sheer will. The journey stripped her of illusion and gifted her strategy. She returned to Constantinople not as the girl who danced for coins, but as a woman who understood one truth: applause is fleeting, power is permanent, and the city was ripe for change. Old alliances crumbled. New players rose. The palace hummed with tension. Theodora, now in her 20s, refused to return to the theater's backstage shadows, the world of exploitation disguised as entertainment. Instead, she disappeared into quiet respectability, taking up woolspinninja, humble trade that demanded patience and discipline. To observers, it looked like retreat. They were wrong. This was reinvention. She let gossip reshape her. The scandalous actress had become pious, modest, even virtuous. In a city where rumors could topple emperors, reputation was the sharpest weapon. And during this quiet chapter, fate delivered her greatest opportunity. Justinian, nephew of the emperor, heir to the throne, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly unlike the aristocrats who sneered at her past. He hadn't inherited power. He'd seized it through intellect and will, and he recognized the same fire in her. What began as fascination deepened into admiration, then something far more dangerous: partnership. Their meetings, though discreet, crackled with electricity. Justinian saw in Theodora a mind equal to his own, resilient, strategic, unafraid. She saw in him a ladder to power and a chance to reshape an empire. Constantinople buzzed with scandal. They didn't care. A union was forming, one that would not just change their lives, but shake Byzantium to its foundations. Justinian's devotion to Theodora wasn't romance alone. It was revolution in the making. Justinian's attachment to Theodora grew into something fierce, unshakably, utterly scandalous to the Byzantine elite. To them, it was unthinkable. The heir to the empire, a man shaping laws, commanding armies, and rebuilding the very architecture of state, would bind his fate to a former actress, a woman once dismissed as a courtesan. In Constantinople, where social rank was etched deeper than marble and lineage dictated destiny. Theodora's past was meant to be a life sentence. But Justinian was no ordinary errand. Theodora was no ordinary woman. The barrier between them wasn't just gossip or tradition, it was the law itself. Roman statutes, steeped in centuries of aristocratic prejudice, explicitly forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. The stage had branded her legally unworthy of marriage, a stain no amount of charm could erase. For most, that would have been the end. Love shattered on the altar of decree. But Justinian didn't bow to laws. He rewrote them in a sweeping act of legal revolution. He amended imperial code to allow actresses and courtesans who left their former lives to marry freely. It wasn't just reform, it was a declaration. Theodora wasn't a passing fancy. She was the woman he intended to crown. Outrage rippled through the aristocracy. To them, she symbolized moral decay, a living breach in the walls of their rigid world. but to the poor, the voiceless, the women crushed beneath the weight of tradition. She became proof that fate could be rewritten. Their marriage was quiet, almost intimate. Theodora stepped into the public eye, not as a scandal, but as a symbol of transformation. She dressed with restraint, spoke with precision, and carried herself with a composure so commanding that even her fiercest critics had to acknowledge her mind. She was no longer the actress playing roles under stage lights. She was the rising force who would soon shape laws, policies, and the empire's soul. When Justinian was crowned emperor in 527, Theodora was crowned empress beside him, not as ornament, but as equal. She took her place on the throne with regal poise that defied her origins, and the crowd roared not just for their emperor, but for the woman who had clawed her way from the hippodrome's filth to the palace's golden mosaics. Byzantium had rarely witnessed a rise so audacious, or a woman so ready to wield power. No moment defines Theodora's legacy more than the Nika revolt. Burned, what began as a brawl between the blues and greens exploded into full-scale rebellion. Mobs torched government buildings, slaughtered officials, and shouted for Justinian's head. Even the Hagia Sophia was swallowed by flames. The city trembled. Inside the palace, panic spread like smoke. Exhausted and terrified, Justinian considered fleeing across the Bosporus, abandoning the throne to save his skin. His advisors urged escape. For a breathless moment, the Eastern Roman Empire teetered on collapse. Then Theodora rose, while men stammered about escape routes. She delivered a speech that would echo through centuries. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. She declared she would rather die in purple, the color of emperors, than live in exile, hunted and humiliated. These weren't theatrical words. They were forged in steel. Her survival without honor was no survival at all. The room fell silent. Justinian, who had always admired her resolve, found his own courage reignited. Instead of fleeing, he struck back. With generals Belisarius and Mundus, he unleashed a merciless counterattack on the Hippodrome, where 30,000 rebels had gathered, believing victory was theirs. The slaughter was swift. The rebellion shattered. The throne was saved. History credits Justinian with preserving the empire. But those who were there knew the truth. Theodora saved Byzantium in the aftermath. Her influence deepened. Justinian consulted her on laws, diplomacy, military strategy, on everything. She wasn't just empress. She was strategist, anchor, and conscience. In a court drowning in intrigue, she had proven she wasn't decoration beside the throne, she was backbone. And she wielded that power with purpose. While Justinian codified laws that shaped the empire's skeleton, Theodora infused them with humanity. She championed protections for women abandoned by husbands, outlawed forced prostitution, secured property rights for widows, and funded safe houses for former courtesans seeking new lives. This wasn't charity. It was justice. It was Theodora confronting a world that once tried to break her and ensuring others wouldn't suffer the same fate. She pushed for women to inherit land, own property, and refuse forced marriages. The aristocracy sneered. She didn't care. She had lived powerlessness. Now she held power and used it like a blade. Yet her compassion never dulled her political instincts. Theodora navigated court rivalries with a quiet ferocity that unnerved her enemies. Ambitious generals, scheming senators, even church patriarchs, none were safe from her calculations. She rarely struck in public. She preferred silence, precision, and consequences that arrived like winter, inevitable and cold. Her support swelled among the lower classes, especially women, who saw in her a living testament to what was possible. They watched as she issued decrees, shaped policy, and rewrote laws with the same ease others used to spread gossip. Even Justinian deferred to her judgment. In matters of state, her word carried weight. The more her reforms spread, the clearer it became. Theodora wasn't just improving Byzantine life, she was redefining what power could look like, and for a radiant, fleeting moment in history, she succeeded. But power in Byzantium was never secure. It was a shifting chessboard where every player plotted their rise. And Theodora, born in chaos and forged in spectacle, knew survival demanded vigilance, not virtue. Her greatest challenge emerged from the Monophysite controversia, theological rift tearing the empire apart. Justinian wavered, seeking unity through doctrine. Theodora acted with conviction. She had seen how faith could be twisted into oppression. While Justinian convened councils, she opened the palace gates to persecuted bishops and monks, offering sanctuary to those condemned by orthodoxy. The Orthodox faction recoiled. They called her a dangerous wild card, a threat to imperial unity. She called it mercy. Her court became a refuge for the vulnerably silent rebuke. To those who believed religious authority belonged only to men in robes. Yet, theological battles were just one front. The palace itself seethed with rivals, jealous aristocrats, ambitious senators, generals who bristled at taking orders from a woman who refused to play the passive empress. Whispers grew. She meddles too much. She let them talk, then outmaneuvered them. One of her most complex alliances was with Antonina, wife of General Belisarius, a woman as cunning as Theodora herself. Together, they navigated court politics with lethal grace, neutralizing threats and stabilizing a fragile empire. They were two women in a man's world, and they became its decisive architects. But Theodora's power was never about destruction, was about legacy. She negotiated in shadows, intervened in crises, and orchestrated outcomes not with armies, but with influence. Whether through quiet pressure or strategic alliances, she ensured no threat, foreign or domestic, could fester unchecked. In an empire ruled by emperors with swords, Theodora ruled with strategy, and soon all knew Byzantium had two sovereigns, and neither could be ignored. By the mid-540s, the iron will that had carried her from hippodrome dust to imperial gold began to weary. Illness crept in not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of an enemy who knew it couldn't defeat her head-on. Historians believe it was breast cancer, a scourge Byzantine medicine couldn't comprehend, let alone cure. Yet even as her body faltered, her mind burned bright. The palace noticed first. Days once packed with councils, petitions, and legal reviews grew shorter. Servants watched her rise with effort. Courtiers whispered hopes of her decline. They underestimated her. Theodora had spent a lifetime refusing to be defined by circumstance. She wouldn't start now. Justinian, consumed by empire, grew deeply concerned. Their marriage, once a scandal, had matured into a profound partnership. He still sought her counsel on taxes, theology, war. Even when her voice weakened, her judgment shaped the realm. Her final years became a race against time. She worked relentlessly to lock in her reforms, shield vulnerable groups, and place allies in key posts. She knew her enemies would try to erase her work the moment she was gone. She was determined to deny them that victory outside the palace. The empire mirrored her struggle, plagued by war, rebellion, and plague. Yet it held, largely because Theodora had mastered the art of stabilizing chaos. She tempered Justinian's ambition with pragmatism, grounding his dreams in reality. On June 28, 548, she died at just 48. Justinian was shattered. The empire mourned a woman who had risen from society's lowest rung to become one of its most formidable forces. Even her enemies, though relieved, could not deny her brilliance. Her death did not silence her influence, it amplified it. To aristocrats, she remained the scandalous upstart to the poor. She was a symbol of defiance to Justinian. She was irreplaceable, partner, advisor, anchor. In the years after, he ruled with renewed intensity, as if finishing the work they'd begun together. He expanded legal reforms, fortified the state, and completed the Hagia Sophia's golden mosaics, immortalizing Theodora. But as a queen, robed in jewels, haloed in dignity, offering gifts to the altar, a visual declaration. Her story would not be erased. Her greatest legacy lived in the laws she shaped: rights for women in marriage, inheritance, property, and protection from exploitation. These weren't footnotes. They were seismic shifts in Byzantine society, echoes that rippled through European and Near Eastern legal traditions for centuries. But perhaps her most enduring triumph was the audacity of her life itself. She rose from a world where actresses were treated as little more than beggars and carved a place not beside the emperor, but within the machinery of empire. Her story became a challenge to every rigid hierarchy, a testament that intelligence, resilience, and courage could outmaneuver birthright. Historians still debate her motives, but none deny her impact. Theodora's life was a storm, fierce, unpredictable, transformative. She forced Byzantium to confront its prejudices, reshaped its laws, and etched her name into its foundations. And though centuries have passed, her shadow still stretches across history, a reminder that greatness can rise from anywhere, and that power, once claimed, can redefine an empire now. Shift east and west, where two legends were born in fire: Saladin and Richard. The Lionheart entered history from opposite ends of the world, yet both were forged in childhood to become men whose names would thunder through time. Saladin was born in 1137 in Tikrit, a fortress town of hard stone, disciplined households, and the ever-present weight. His Kurdish family served the great dynasties of the Islamic world not just as warriors, but as scholars, judges, and statesmen. From boyhood, he was steeped in discussions of law, philosophy, and strategy. His earliest lessons weren't in slaughter, but in patience, justice, and the idea that true power meant responsibility before glory. Richard's childhood unfolded in a world of glittering courts and turbulent politics. Born in 1157 in Oxford, he grew up in the Angevin Empire, sprawling, fractious realm stitched together by the iron will of his parents, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. While Saladin studied restraint, Richard absorbed pageantry. While Saladin learned quiet strategy, Richard was fed tales of heroic knights, holy quests, and glorious battles by troubadours in gilded halls. By 16, Richard led armies. By 22, he was feared across France's name, synonymous with bold charges, fearless assaults, and a charisma that drew knights to his banner like moths to flame. Yet, despite their differences, destiny was weaving their paths toward the same battlefield as the Crusader states faltered under weak leadership and infighting. A new force rose in the Muslim world. Saladin, once uncertain of his martial path, discovered his genius while serving under his uncle Sherku. He grasped the power of unity and began the near impossible task of binding Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia under one banner, not for conquest, but for a higher cause, the recovery of Jerusalem. Across Europe, the call of the crusade ignited Richard's soul, a king who cared more for the sword than the scepter. He saw the Holy Land not just as a religious duty, but as the ultimate proving ground for legend. Two men, shaped by opposing worlds, were being drawn toward a single destiny, not merely as enemies, but as rivals fated to clash, respect, and remember each other forever. But before Saladin could face Richard, he had to conquer a greater foe, division itself. The Muslim world in the 12th century was a patchwork of rival emirs, feuding dynasties, and mutual distrust. Egypt languished under the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate. Syria was carved among squabbling princes. Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands, weak but defiant. No one believed unification was possible, but Saladin did. He learned the brutal truths of Middle Eastern politics, how alliances were forged with handshakes and broken with daggers. But he also mastered a rarer art, winning loyalty through fairness, not fear. When Sherku died, Saladin unexpectedly became vizier of Egypt. Many dismissed him as a placeholder. They were wrong. With deft diplomacy, strategic generosity, and decisive action, he dismantled the Fatimid regime and restored Egypt to Sunni rule. It was a masterstroke, giving him the financial and military base he needed to unite the Islamic heartland. He took cities not just by force, but by persuasion, offering clemency to foes and stability to war-weary lands. Each victory strengthened his legend, not as a conqueror by birth, but as a leader chosen by destiny. Only one prize remained: Jerusalem. For decades, its loss had been a wound in the heart of Islam. Saladin promised not vengeance, but restoration, a return of dignity after chaos. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he shattered the Crusader armies in a single, devastating stroke. Jerusalem fell soon after, yet without massacre. Christians were allowed to leave peacefully upon payment of ransom. Thousands who expected slaughter were spared. His mercy shocked Europe. His chivalry became legend, and across the sea, one man listened with burning intensity: Richard the Lionheart, newly crowned King of England. Warrior king, glory-seeker, their collision was now inevitable. As Saladin unified the Muslim world, Europe erupted in outrage. The fall of Jerusalem lit a fuse across Christendom. Preachers thundered. Knights swore oaths. Kings felt the weight of divine duty. None embraced it more fiercely than Richard. He didn't need convincing. The crusade was his calling, the perfect stage for the legend he was born to become. A warrior chosen by God, a knight destined for immortality. He inherited a kingdom, drowning in debt, but cared little for ruling. He sold lands, emptied treasuries, and prepared for war as if it were sacred pilgrimage. Eleanor, who nay. He inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, but cared little for ruling. He sold lands, emptied treasuries, and prepared for war as if it were sacred pilgrimage. Eleanor, who knew her son's soul better than anyone, supported his quest. Richard wasn't made for peace. He was born for battle. His journey to the Holy Land was epic and brutal. His fleet nearly drowned in Mediterranean storms. When survivors were mistreated on Cyprus, Richard invaded without hesitation. He conquered the island in weeks, reshaping its rule and turning it into a vital crusader stronghold. His ruthlessness stunned some, inspired others. One truth was clear: Richard would not be slowed by insult, obstacle, or warning. Every challenge was just another chance to prove his fire. When he finally reached Acre in 1191, the Crusader forces were exhausted. To step into one of Emperor Nero's banquets was to step out of reality and into a fever dream of imperial delusion. His dining halls weren't spaces for food, they were stages for godhood, meticulously engineered to overwhelm every sense and leave no doubt. Rome had never seen a ruler like him. Every wall, every fountain, every drifting scent existed for one purpose: to glorify Nero and transport his guests into a world where he alone wielded the power to astonish. Even before the feast began, the entrance was theater. Slaves draped in shimmering silks guided guests through corridors of polished marble, where torchlight glinted like molten gold. Behind lattice screens, harpists played melodies so soft they seemed accidental, yet perfectly timed to stoke anticipation like a slow-burning fuse. Then the doors opened, a warm wave of scented air rushed out. Rose water, cinnamon myrrh, saffron perfumed, proof that even the atmosphere bent to Nero's vision. Above, the ceiling itself defied physics. Rumored across the empire, it was a marvel of hidden gears and rotating panels designed to mimic the turning heavens. From it, rose petals rained down in gentle pink snowfalls, drifting onto reclining diners. Sometimes they fell to heavily burying guests until they choked or gasped for air. Nero found this hilarious. He valued spectacle far more than comfort. At the hall's heart, silver fountains gushed not with water, but with wine honeyed spiced, drawn from the empire's farthest corners. Their ruby glow bathed the room in liquid fire. Servants refilled goblets the moment they dipped below full. Tables of ivory and mother verve curved like a crescent moon around Nero's throne-like couch. From there, he watched every reaction of envy, terror, delight, teach one a silent tribute to his power. Gold-accented braziers burned rare woods, sending aromatic smoke curling through the air like ghostly dancers. The warmth thickened, the scents deepened. The entire experience was choreographed and raw intimidation. By the time guests settled onto their couches, the message was undeniable. In this room, Nero wasn't merely emperor, he was the god of the feast, and everyone else was there to witness his glory. If the hall was a temple, The guests were unwilling worshippers, participants in a ritual where admiration was compulsory and fear inescapable. Invitations were coveted, yes, but also dreaded. They were gilded summons wrapped in danger. Senators, generals, poets, governors reclined on purple-threaded couches, knowing that a single laugh, a pause, a glance could be read as loyalty or treason. It all depended on Nero's mood. Appearances were everything. Silk stolas dusted with gold, togas bleached to blinding white, gemstones plundered from distant lands. But beneath the glitter, stomachs twisted like storm clouds. Everyone knew Nero's charm could curdle into cruelty faster than oil could catch flame. A misplaced compliment, suspicious to little praise for his poetry, dangerous. A raised eyebrow during his singing, potentially fatal. Seating was its own drama. Nero placed favorites close, those who fed his ego without interruption. Farther down sat the wary, the disgraced, the doomed, men who had crossed the wrong faction or simply fallen out of favor. They ate in silence, hoping to vanish into the background. But Nero rarely let anyone stay invisible for long. As the feast began, slaves moved with silent precision, pouring wine, presenting dishes like sacred offerings. Yet guests barely touched a drop without first glancing at the emperor. Should they sip? Wait. Was a proclamation coming? Every choice was a gamble, and then the surprises began. A hidden panel might slide open to release dancers. A mechanical bird might swoop overhead, showering more petals. Or worse, Nero himself would rise, robed like a demigod, face powdered, eyes gleaming, ready to perform. He recited epic verses, sang mournful arias, composed on the spot. His expression always hungry not for art, but for validation. Guests erupted in thunderous applause, terrified to be the first to stop. Even the silence between courses crackled with tension. Every breath was a performance. Every smile a survival tactic. This wasn't dining. It was a test, and failure meant exile, ruin, or a quiet disappearance into the night before nerves could settle. The parade of dishes began, not meals, but acts of culinary theater designed to astonish, intimidate, and sometimes horrify. Nero believed food should shock as much as it satisfied. Each course arrived like a scene from a myth, carried by lines of expressionless slaves who moved as if in a trance. First, visual marvels. Oysters on beds of ice, hauled from alpine peaks, each shell dusted in gold leaf. Figs dripping with saffron-infused honey sweetness meant to soften trembling guests. But this was only the prelude. Nero's chefs were commanded to defy nature. Peacocks roasted whole, their iridescent feathers painstakingly reattached so they appeared untouched by fire. Flamingo tongues arranged like petals in crystal bowls. Dormice stuffed with pine nuts and herbs. Boar carved so lifelike its hide seemed to breathe, mouth packed with fruit as though it had sauntered in willingly. Each dish screamed the same truth. Nero's wealth can reshape reality. Sometimes, cruelty masqueraded as innovation. Fish served still twitching from the sea-proof, he declared that Rome commands the ocean itself. Or meat sculpted into mythical beasts, hydras of layered pork, phoenixes of spiced fowl, presented to dramatic fanfare as musicians swelled into crescendo as courses mounted. Guests slipped into sensory overload. The air grew thick with cardamom, rose, oil, and smoke. Heat flushed their skin. Wine flowed endlessly. Time blurred. For some, it was ecstasy. For others, suffocation. Yet no one dared refuse a dish. Refusal was insult. Insult was death, even if sickened or revolted. They smiled, nodded, and took a bite, knowing Nero watched every reaction, hunting for proof of awe. To dine at his table wasn't to eat, it was to submit to his imagination, his excess, and the monstrous conviction that indulgence was his divine right. And then came the entertainment, because, for Nero, a banquet wasn't complete unless it bled into theater, circus, and nightmare. He didn't want guests merely fed, he wanted them unmoored, dazzled, broken down until their only anchor was him. The night might open with dancers carrying lanterns shaped like griffins and serpents, moving like gods descending from Olympus, their faces serene, their eyes hollow slaves trained to perform without feeling. The music was ethereal, the choreography divine, yet beneath it hummed something deeply unnerving. Then the actors arrived. Nero adored tragedy. He forced guests to endure full scenes mid-feast, tales of tyrants driven mad, lovers doomed by fate, gods exacting brutal vengeance stories that mirrored his own growing infamy a little too closely. No one dared look bored. They wept on cue. They cheered on command. They clapped until their palms burned. And sometimes Nero took the stage himself, robed in shimmering gold. Face painted like Apollo, he'd launch into arias of his own composition, voice soaring or screeching over trembling musicians. Guests applauded wildly, whether he sang like an angel or a wounded peacock. Honesty was suicide. Enthusiasm was survival. But not all spectacles were artistic. Occasionally, the mood darkened. Exotic beasts in chains, condemned prisoners reciting verse before being dragged away, gladiators demonstrating killing techniques on dummies in the hall's shadowed corners. The message was clear. Nero controlled not just luxury and art, but life itself. The atmosphere hovered in that razor-thin space between awe and dread. One moment, you were drowning in perfume and poetry. The next, you were staring into the eyes of a man who could end your life as casually as he ordered. Another round of wine. In Nero's banquet hall, pleasure and peril shared the same plate, and every guest knew the only safe course was to worship the emperor, even as your soul quietly screamed. One moment, guests roared with laughter at a body skit. The next, a tiger muscles coiled, eyes blazing, was dragged snarling past their couches, its breath hot with hunger. Every performance, whether sublime or savage, hammered home the same truth. Nero's banquets were stages for his ego, and everyone in the room was part of the cast, whether they liked it or not. As the night deepened, celebration curdled into captivity. These weren't mere dinner parties. They were marathons of sensory overload and psychological warfare, stretching toward dawn like a slow unraveling of sanity. By midnight, guests no longer felt honored. They felt like prisoners, swaddled in silk, trapped inside an emperor's fevered dream. Wine flowed without end, carried by an army of silent slaves who drifted like ghosts between couches. Goblets were never allowed to empty. If a cup ran dry, Nero took it as a personal slightin', slaves paid in lashes for the lapse. Under that pressure, guests drank far beyond desire. The alcohol dulled their senses. When the doors finally opened at sunrise, guests stumbled out, not refreshed, but hollow-eyed, trembling, silent. They hadn't attended a feast. They'd survived a ritual of power. Beneath the glittering surface of Nero's banquets lay something far more sinister than decadence. These weren't indulgences. They were weapons, carefully crafted instruments of political domination. Every petal, every note, every sip of spiced wine was engineered to dazzle the senses and erode the will. To dine with Nero was to step onto a psychological battlefield, disguised as a luxury event. Senators arrived, hoping to curry favor with gifts or flattery. But Nero cared little for obvious praise. What he craved was submission deep, emotional dependence that left his guests desperate to please him, terrified of disappointing him, and utterly confused about where admiration ended and terror began. Careers rose and fell based on how convincingly a man laughed at the wrong joke or toasted the emperor's latest poem. A well-timed compliment could earn a province. A moment of silence could earn a tomb. Nero used the feast's chaos to push dangerous agendas, new taxes, purges, grandiose building projects, while his guests were too drunk, too tired, or too overwhelmed to resist. How could you argue policy when you're drowning in rose-scented fog? Dancers swirling around you, and the ceiling raining down flowers. He didn't just intimidate his enemies, he disarmed them. He tested loyalties like a puppeteer testing strings. Who leaned in during his monologues on art? Who flinched at poems about betrayal? Who whispered to whom? Sometimes he planted actors among the guests, disguised as nobles to eavesdrop and report back, and humiliation was always on the menu, without warning. Nero might call a senator to the center of the hall and demand he sing, dance, or debate, philosophizing full well the man had no talent. The audience, trapped on their couches, had no choice but to cheer. The victim had no choice but to obey. Nero's laughter afterward often decided their fate in this gilded theater of control. Food was merely the bait. The real feast was Nero's pleasure in watching Rome's elite swallow their pride, one humiliating course at a time. As his reign decayed, so did the mood of his banquets. Extravagance gave way to paranoia so thick it clung to the wine like poison. Rumors slithered through Rome. Death could slip into your cup unnoticed. The emperor's smile often preceded doom. No one, no matter how loyal, was safe. Poison became the unspoken guest at every table. Though Nero never confessed to its use, the timing of certain deaths was too convenient to ignore. Senators who angered him fell ill days after attending a feast, wasting away in mysterious agony. All remembered the story of his mother, Agrippina, killed with poisoned mushrooms. If he could murder his own flesh and blood, what chance did a senator have? Guests learned the desperate art of survival. They watched their cups like hawks. They waited for others to taste dishes first. They prayed the food tasters weren't part of the show. Too eager, accused of flattery, too cautious, branded a conspirator. The perfect guest walked a razor's edge between rapture and dread. Nero's paranoia bled into every detail. He seated rivals beside caged leopards, letting them hear the low growl of death inches away. He invented cruel parlor games demanding spontaneous confessions disguised as entertainment. Slaves who served the meal sometimes vanished afterward, never to be seen again, leaving guests to wonder what they'd overheard. And then there were Nero's sudden rages. The same man who wept over a poetic verse could, seconds later, hurl a goblet and order a man dragged away. Guests tensed at every shift in his voice, measuring their responses like bomb diffusers. Some feasts ended in blood. Men were accused mid-course, seized by guards, and executed before their wine went cold. Others were invited back the next day only to be arrested the moment they stepped through the palace gates. In these final years, Nero's banquets were no longer celebrations. They were death sentences wrapped in silk beneath golden ceilings and perfumed fountains. Rome's most powerful men learned a terrible truth. To dine with Nero was to dine with death itself, as the empire crumbled under corruption, rebellion, and ruin. Nero's feasts grew only more grotesque if he could drown reality in wine and petals. Nowhere was this more horrifying than after the Great Fire, while neighborhoods lay in ash. Families searched for loved ones in the rubble, and refugees huddled in tents. Nero threw banquets that mocked human suffering. He hosted senators in newly gilded halls draped in eastern silks and studded with jewels, a cruel reminder that his palace stood pristine while Rome burned. Whether he truly played the lyre as the city collapsed, few could say, but the image stuck, an emperor singing as the world turned to cinders. After the fire, his feasts intensified. He decorated halls in hues of flame gold, crimson, ember orange, flickering in lamplight. Guests whispered, was he honoring the dead or celebrating their destruction? He unveiled his domus, Oreitha, golden houses, sprawling palace, less of stone and more of delusion. Marble forests, indoor lakes under painted skies, ceilings glittering with gemstones, benches padded with exotic furs, fountains that sprayed wine as casually as water. Inside, he staged mock naval battles in artificial lakes, with costumed slaves splashing through miniature seas. He summoned actors to perform scenes of rebirth, declaring that Rome rose again because of him. Guests clapped with trembling hands. Terrified, their applause sounded hollow, but beneath the spectacle, horror festered. The contrast between Nero's glittering world and Rome's charred ruins became unbearable. Many began to wonder, had he slipped into madness, or had he simply decided that his people's suffering was the perfect backdrop for his divine drama? Either way, one truth was clear. These feasts no longer celebrated Rome. They celebrated Nero, and Nero alone. In his final years, the banquets lost their luster not from lack of gold, but from lack of belief. The emperor, who once orchestrated miracles of light and sound, now seemed a man haunted by conspiracies, betrayals, and the ghost of his own crumbling mind. The feasts continued, but they were frantic, now desperate attempts to drown the truth in noise and wine. His last great banquet was remembered not for splendor, but for dread. The hall, though dazzling, felt heavy as if the air itself refused to celebrate. Even the rose petals fell slower, burdened by the knowledge that rebellion brewed in the provinces. Legions turned against him, and senators sharpened their knives in shadowed rooms. Nero tried to distract them. He summoned performers. He sang. But his voice wavered not with passion, but with strain. Sweat beaded on his brow. His laughter came too loud. His gestures too sharp. The smooth god-emperor was gone. In his place stood a paranoid shell, clinging to applause like a drowning man to driftwood. When the first course arrived, a phoenix sculpted from meat and spice, symbol of rebirth, most guests could barely swallow. They'd heard the news. Galba marched. The Praetorian Guard wavered. The Senate plotted. Every toast tasted like ashes. Every song sounded like a dirge. For the first time, Nero seemed to sense the fear in the room. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for loyalty he no longer trusted. Even his favorites looked away. The illusion had shattered. The emperor was performing only for himself. Before dawn, he ended the feast and vanished into the palace's echoing halls. Days later, Rome turned on him. He fled in secret, died alone in a dusty Villano crown. No music, no audience, just silence. His banquets, once emblems of divine power and artistic obsession, became something else entirely. Warnings that excess breeds madness, that spectacle can become tyranny, and that even emperors who dine like gods can fall like mortals.